Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, the 30 books I read in June. So yes, I got through a lot of books in June, partly because I had a week's holiday at the end of June, and in fact almost half of the reading I did in the month was done during that week. But yeah, got through a lot. And it was, of course, the month of Jude on the Range, the fantastic Western-themed reading event hosted or created by Michael K. Vaughan, of which I was, again, one of the co-hosts. So really enjoyed reading some Westerns for that. A lot of the reading I've done this month was done digitally, so was done on either my Kobo Libre Colour or my Books Go Colour 7, both of which devices I've done reviews of on the channel if you're interested in that. So yeah, partly because I was away for that week at the end of the month. I always, when I'm away nowadays, like to take an e-reader rather than taking a stack of books because it's just easier for travelling. What that does mean though is I don't have that many books to show you physically today, which means it's going to take me ages to edit and put all the little pictures up there so you can see the books I read. Anyway, I'll stop waffling and get on with the books. So, the first book I read was for June on the Range, and that was Appaloosa by Robert B. Parker. I actually read two Robert B. Parker books this month. Really enjoyed both of them. He's best known for his Spenser series of detective novels, and the other book I read was one of those. This was from a series of Western novels he's written about these two guys, one of whom becomes the sheriff of the town in this book, and his buddy, becomes his deputy. And I think in the series of books they travel around different towns and kind of fight the bad guys in those towns. So fairly standard Western fare, but just really, really well done. In particular, in this book, I really enjoyed the relationship between the main character, who's like the buddy character, who's the narrator, and this woman he meets in the town. So some just nice humour and things like that woven into the story, but also some fantastic kind of Western shootouts and that kind of thing. So that was a lot of fun. I also read this month 3 volumes in the Saga series by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. So I started that series in May. So a series of comic books. I'm reading the collected editions, which have each got, I think, 6 issues in or something like that. They're really fantastic. It's a really great series, full of heart and inventiveness. So really creative science fiction about this family who are formed from the opposing sides in a war, basically. So a man and a woman who've fallen in love, but they're on opposing sides in the war, and they've had a daughter. And the books are kind of narrated by her. Fantastic artwork from Fiona Staples. Just really engaging, enjoyable science fiction. I'm absolutely loving the series, and will definitely be continuing with it. Next, another Western for June on the Range. This was sent to me by the author Dirk Hawkman. So this is Vulture Wings. This was just really fun. I really like these Black Horse Western books. This is a British publisher of Western books. I think they're out of business now, but you often find these books in libraries. They're kind of perfect for libraries because they're very durable and they're just enjoyable Westerns. Well, this one certainly was. So this is about 2 brothers, teenage brothers, who get kidnapped by a gang of baddies and made to do bad stuff for them, and about their dad trying to rescue them. Really just a solid, enjoyable Western. Next then, 2 of the suggested prompts from Michael for June on the Range are to read a book by Zane Grey, one of the classic Western authors, and also one by Louis L'Amour. I read The Border Legion by Zane Grey. I have this lovely first edition of it, which was very kindly sent to me by Heidi, one of my subscribers. This was fun. So this is about a young woman who kind of heads out of town and ends up getting involved with all these outlaws. Zane Grey does a fantastic job of 2 things, I think. One is of showing you what the landscape is like, so describing the Western landscape and the environment, and that's a big part of Westerns. If you think of Western movies, what you often think of is those great panoramic landscape shots. So Zane Grey does a really good job of that, but also just does a good job of describing almost like everyday life. So what it was like to be a regular person, and in particular in this book and in the other books I've read by him, what it's like to be kind of somewhat outside of society, like living on the land. So yeah, I enjoyed that a lot. It's a bit weird, it's definitely quite dated in some ways, and the way he kind of, the way the plot plays out can feel a bit odd at times. It's hugely melodramatic at times, but just, quite entertaining and fun. After that then, I read a Louis L'Amour book, High Lonesome. So this again was fun. I didn't like it as much as the Zane Grey book, but it was entertaining enough. So about a bank robber and his gang, and this woman he falls in love with. So again, fairly standard Western fare. And I think, again, Louis L'Amour, like Zane Grey, I think became such a successful author because there's a feeling of like realism about his books. It feels they feel convincing in terms of their depiction of like life in the Old West. So yeah, that was fun, but yeah, not quite as good as the Zane Grey. After that, something very different. I have done a review of this one on the channel. I didn't love it, but it was interesting. It's Deliver Me by Elle Nash. So this is kind of a modern Southern Gothic, very weird and gross at times, about this young woman, and like almost too bleak. So it feels like it goes out of its way to be kind of bleak and a bit depressing. So about this young woman who's in a terrible, like, abusive relationship. She works in like a factory slaughtering chickens. So it's all just a bit grubby and nasty, and goes in a very weird direction. At the end of this book is, I thought, too weird. I thought it just didn't really work with the rest of the story. And it all felt, one of my commenters, Eerie, commented on this book that it felt like someone writing about what their impression of living a life like the characters in this book live, rather than someone who's actually got any lived experience of living that kind of life, if that makes sense. So it just all feels slightly artificial. And, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but I think the book becomes less convincing because of that. And I've just praised Louis L'Amour and Zane Grey for writing convincingly about a life that was different from the lives they led. I think for that Elle Nash book, that's not necessarily true. I don't think she felt convincing to me as a writer. After that then, I read My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. An interesting book. Again, it was a book I thought was really well written, but I didn't love it. So a book about the abusive relationship between a teacher and one of his students, told from the perspective of the student, like really disturbing at times. Really interesting examination of the effects of abuse on a teenager. So yeah, an interesting book, but not one that I loved. After that, as part of my ongoing reading of Patricia Highsmith's books, which I'm doing with Anne from the channel and of Elle, we read People Who Knock on the Door. So this is a later Highsmith book. We're nearly kind of at the end of our voyage of reading all of her books. This was about Christian fundamentalism in the US and its impacts on one family, particularly about the kind of elder son who's kind of in his late teens, early 20s. His dad becomes like a member of a local church and becomes kind of a bit obsessed with it. So it was a really interesting book. Definitely not Highsmith's best, but as is common with a lot of her books, the story is really compelling. And when you get to the end of the book, you feel like the book is more than the sum of its parts. I did think it was very good, but yeah, not my favourite of hers. After that, I read Magic Incorporated by Robert A. Heinlein from this book. This was a really interesting book, written in the 40s, but it feels really current. It feels like it may well have been the inspiration for many kind of urban fantasy type books today. So about a kind of version of America where magic is like real, and about this guy who's a magician who gets involved with this kind of local mob. So like a fun kind of crime story, but with magical elements as well. It was interesting and enjoyable, and as I say, definitely felt ahead of its time given it was written in the 40s. Next up then, another kind of newer disturbing-ish book like the Elle Nash book, and again one I didn't love, Hawk Mountain by Conor Habib. So I've done a review of this on the channel. This is a book where I thought the first third was excellent, and after that it just got too much and just went off the rails. So about a guy and his young son, the guy's high school bully reinserts himself into his life. So he hasn't seen him since the end of high school, but the guy turns up again and acts like they're friends, and moves in with them and becomes part of their life. And it's just enjoyably uncomfortable at first, but then the story progresses and it just got too much for me, and I didn't particularly enjoy it. Okay, after that, again for June on the Range, I read Slaughter Road by George G. Gilman, which is the 22nd of the Edge series of westerns. So I'm reading these in order, and have been since the start of the channel. My first video on the channel was a review of an Edge book. So this was entertaining but silly, so as these books often are. They're at their best when they're a bit more serious and gritty. This one was just a bit silly. So basically in this one, Edge is in San Francisco, which is unusual. It's unusual for him to be in a big city. So that part of it was quite interesting. He's in San Francisco. There's a lost Leonardo da Vinci painting that's turned up that's being auctioned, and it gets stolen, and he gets involved in trying to get it back, basically. So it was kind of fun. Okay, after that then, a kind of slightly off-topic book I read for June on the Range, Mr. Midshipman Hornblower by C.S. Forrester. So I read this to test my theory that the British equivalent of the Western is the naval adventure. So Hornblower being, one of the most famous naval adventure series. This is the first of the stories chronologically. So it follows Hornblower when he first joins the Navy. And it was interesting. It was a fun read. It felt quite episodic, so it's almost more like a series of short stories than a novel. But it was entertaining. There's some great scenes in it. Some great kind of scrapes that Hornblower gets into and manages to get out of. And he was a really engaging central character. So I can see why that series ended up being so successful. Next up then, 2 books for the Coltons of Summer. Is that what it's called? I think that's what the event's called, something like that. Coltons of Summer, which is being run by Sarah from the channel The Bookish Knitter. So this is the first 2 books in the Coltons of Montana series. So I read both of them back to back in this Mills and Boon double. So the first one is Colton by Marriage by Marie Ferrarela. And the second one is Covert Agent's Virgin Affair by Linda Conrad. So this is a series that centres around this town in Montana. At the start of the first book, a body shows up. The police discover this body or get called to this body that's been discovered. And it's the corpse of somebody who everybody in the town thinks died 15 years ago. But it's a fresh body. So it's a really great central concept. And the stories that follow on from that, all have that as the central overarching plot. But involve different characters and different romances. So these were both fun. I enjoyed the second one a bit more than the first. I felt that the kind of suspense element of it was better integrated with the romance, and it was a bit spicier as well. Not that that's necessarily a category that I rate books on, but it definitely was. So yeah, those were both entertaining romantic suspense reads. Okay, after that then, my book for the Criminally Book Club that I run with my patrons and channel members. So that was The Watchers by Jon Steele, which was an enjoyable kind of fantasy horror thriller. So about these 3 characters in Lausanne in Switzerland, all very different from each other. So one of them was a kind of washed up British private investigator. One of them's a high-class sex worker, and one of them is like a guy who works in the local cathedral ringing the bells, and they all get involved in this kind of weird mystery. So it was fun enough, but I didn't enjoy it as much as I was expecting to. And as the kind of the mystery, the magical elements of the story start coming out, I found myself enjoying it less and less. Next up then, and we're getting into my holiday period now, I read The Chisolms by Evan Hunter. So Evan Hunter's my favourite author, wrote over 100 books, and I'm gradually working my way through them. This was the only Western he wrote, and so this is like a kind of frontier story about this family travelling across America to get to California to start a new life there. And it was entertaining enough, but not fantastic. So all of the characters of the family were quite interesting, quite different from each other. There's some interesting, kind of peril and stuff like kind of geographical, environmental type peril they get into and that kind of thing. So it was a fun enough read, but it wasn't fantastic. After that then, I read the second Robert B. Parker book that I read this month, and that was the second of the Spenser series of detective novels, God Save the Child. So this was really good. So Spenser is a private investigator in Boston. He's also a boxer and a great chef. And you get these wonderful scenes in the Spenser books where he kind of pauses after a day of like investigating and like, you know, like wearing out his shoes, tracking around Boston, trying to interview people and getting into scrapes and things like that. He'll then go back to his apartment at the end of the day and you'll get a couple of pages describing him cooking a really nice meal. And I really like those kind of culinary interludes in the series. So in this book, he's investigating the disappearance of a teenage boy. So he's hired by the guys, the kid's parents. And you know, the plot progresses from there. Where I thought this was fantastic. Well, the actual mystery is really good and well played out. And Spenser, as I've said, is a really engaging central character. But what Robert B. Parker does brilliantly in this book is paint a picture of this family at the centre of it. And like their psychology and their relationships with each other and things like that. And I thought, again, a bit like the Patricia Highsmith book, it ends up feeling like more than the sum of its parts. You end up coming away from it thinking, this was a really enjoyable detective novel, but there was something a bit more there. There was a bit more thought there than you sometimes get. So, yeah, enjoyed that enormously. So next up, something completely different. The People's Republic of Walmart by Leigh Phillips and Michal Rozworski. So this is a left-wing economics book about central planning and about how central planning is kind of frowned upon in like capitalist economies, but how capitalist organisations, so big companies like Walmart and Amazon, use central planning to run their businesses effectively. So it was an interesting central concept. Some of the individual chapters were really interesting as well. So the ones about Walmart and Amazon in particular, I found really interesting. There was one about Chile as well, which was fascinating. Overall, as is often the case, I found with non-fiction books like this, it felt like it was a bit too long and maybe, you know, could have made its argument in less pages, but definitely an interesting read. After that, I read Drowning by TJ Newman, which is like an airplane disaster type book. It was okay, but it wasn't fantastic. So this is about, so the situation is this plane crashes, most of the passengers get out, but some of them don't, and the plane then sinks under the water and is like teetering on the edge of a cliff underwater, but they've still got, you know, a certain amount of oxygen within the plane, and divers are coming to rescue them and stuff like that. So it was all a bit over the top and silly. There were parts of the book that I thought worked really well. TJ Newman is was like an airline stewardess. So though the elements that kind of relate to that role, I thought she did well, and her kind of central stewardess characters were quite convincing. But yeah, overall, I didn't think it was fantastic. After that, the first of two Goosebumps books I read. So this was The Cuckoo Clock of Doom, of course, by R.L. Stine. It's fascinating, isn't it, with the Goosebumps books? With any of those, or with most of those long-running series of books, they always have one person's name on the cover. So, you know, like with the Executioner books I read, it's Don Pendleton. But Don Pendleton didn't write, you know, anywhere near all of the Executioner books. R.L. Stine did write all of the Goosebumps books. So an incredibly prolific writer, because there are hundreds of those books. Anyway, this was really fun. So this is about a kid whose dad gets this cursed cuckoo clock that sends him back in time, and it's about him like trying to get back to the present day and like put things that have ended up going wrong as a result of his time travelling right. Really entertaining and a really great funny ending as well. Next I read the third of the Matt Helm books by Donald Hamilton, which is The Removers. So this is kind of a series of, they're kind of almost halfway between crime novels and espionage novels. So Matt Helm was an agent of the CIA or the OSS or whatever during the Second World War, and in the first book has retired and comes back into active service for various reasons, and the following books, you know, follow him going on different missions. But there's definitely elements of crime fiction in this one. In this book, he's in, I think it's Reno, going up against the mob and this like mobster who runs like the local casinos and things like that. So there is a spy element to the books, like an espionage element, but they often feel like crime novels as well. Anyway, just a fun, solid adventure type book. After that, some indie horror. I read Bath Salt Raccoon by DJ James, which was just bonkers. So a book about some idiots who decide to give a raccoon drugs, and it makes it really strong and homicidal, and it goes around killing people, and that insanity starts spreading throughout the town. So you end up with this kind of apocalyptic book with every possible thing that could be going wrong. Just gets crazier and crazier and gorier. It was absolutely disgusting, but very entertaining. After that, something a little bit calmer. So I read Doctor Who: The Crimson Horror by Mark Gatiss. So based on one of the Matt Smith era Doctor Who stories, set in Victorian times, but with kind of alien detectives in Victorian times. It was fun, but I didn't enjoy it as much as the episodes it was based on. I felt like he got a bit too wrapped up in trying to be clever about Victoriana, and didn't spend quite enough time on like the story and the horror elements. Next up then, I read 2 short story collections back to back, both Western ones for June on the Range. So these are both books I've had on my Kindle for ages. So by an author called Edward A. Granger. The 2 books are The Adventures of Cash Laramie and Gideon Miles, Volume 1 and 2. So a bit like Appaloosa, the Robert B. Parker book I talked about at the start. This is about like a couple of friends who kind of travel around, like righting wrongs and helping towns, get rid of bad guys and that kind of thing. So very entertaining, both of them. The thing that's nicely done about these stories is kind of the treatment of race and things like that. So Cash Laramie is half Native American, and Gideon Miles is black, and they encounter a lot of kind of everyday racism in their adventures, but it's all kind of very nicely handled. I thought they were all really enjoyable stories. It's all quite short, quite kind of fun, pulpy short stories, but yeah, an enjoyable read. Next up, and we're nearly at the end now, you'll be glad to hear. Next up, the second Goosebumps book I read. This was My Best Friend is Invisible, which was a bit... I didn't enjoy this one quite as much as the Cuckoo Clock of Doom. I think it has a fun central concept. So basically this kid discovers that there's this invisible kid living in his house, which nobody knows about. And it's about the scrapes they kind of get into, as is often the case with these Goosebumps books. Had a fantastic twist ending that I really enjoyed. So yeah, another fun, diverting, quick, easy read. After that then, Doc Savage Book 7, The Monsters by Kenneth Robeson. Kenneth Robeson being another one of those house names like R.L. Stine isn't, that are, they just churned out loads and loads of books with that name on the cover. So Doc Savage is a kind of this superhero character who's got a bunch of like buddies who travel around with him righting wrongs. In this one, they're investigating this kind of weird circus and these like strange experiments that are being done. Very silly kind of 30s pulp adventure, but very entertaining. Although, should say, this particular Doc Savage book, as some of them do, did have a lot of period racism in it. And then finally read another Western short story collection, Dead Man's Crossing by Joe R. Lansdale. So this is kind of a blend of Western and horror about this character who's kind of a bit of an occult detective. So a guy who travels around like investigating mysterious stuff in the Old West. So a series of stories about him. He's like kind of half preacher, half sheriff. Fun horror stuff, some entertaining kind of action and violence and things like that. Not fantastic overall. I think I preferred the Cash Laramie books slightly, but still really entertaining. As I said, I think in my weekly wrap up where I talked about this book, I think Joe R. Lansdale is best when he's doing like characters that he really gets into, and I never felt he got into this character as much as some of his other ones. So the concepts and storylines were good, but I didn't find myself rooting for the central character as much as I do Happer Leonard in the Happer Leonard books. So that was my June. Plenty of books read and thoroughly enjoyed June on the Range for the 3rd year running. Do let me know in the comments if you took part in June on the Range. Let me know what you read for it. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.